Have you always wanted to play a go-wide token deck that can win the game through multiple and interesting avenues? Do you want to play a deck that maximally abuses tokens and runs the best cards that reward you for having a go-wide creature board state? Do you like the idea of being able to pivot between using your tokens for mana, card advantage, or bodies, depending on what you need at the time? Then let's make it rain in cats and dogs with Jinnie Fay, Jetmir's second. So let's begin by looking at our commander. Jinnie Fay is a 3/3 elf druid that costs a Gruul hybrid, a green, and a Selesnya hybrid, and says, if you would create one or more tokens, you may instead create that many 2/2 green cat creature tokens with haste, or that many 3/1 green dog creature tokens with vigilance. Now I think there might be a bit to unpack here with Jinnie that makes it better than what she first appears. First of all, she says any token, not just a creature token, so we can take any token maker and convert them to bodies. Secondly, it is a May ability, which is actually quite relevant and useful because it means we can run token makers that have additional utility. Some good examples include treasure tokens for mana, clue tokens for card draw, and even food tokens for life gain. It also means we can pivot between keeping the tokens as they are or converting them to bodies, depending on what we need at the time. This is actually quite important because that means now our deck slots can serve multiple purposes. For example, treasure makers can now fill the mana accelerator slot. The next thing to look at with Jinnie is the tokens she creates, because their stat lines actually allow us to abuse some powerful cards. Let's start with the cats. Having 2 power means we can take advantage of cards that care about low powered creatures, and having haste means that if we can generate a large amount of tokens on our turn, we can swing in with them immediately. It also means if we can turn our cats into mana dorks, they can tap for mana immediately, but more on that later. Let's move on to the dogs. Having 3 power allows them to present a powerful combat threat when swinging in, and the vigilance makes this doubly so because it means when you swing in, you're not leaving yourself unprotected. Now, while having 1 power does seem pretty bad, especially when swinging in, it does allow us to abuse a very powerful card draw piece, which I'm sure some of you could guess. And finally, both our cats and dogs enhance some already powerful finishes typically used in go-wide strategies, which actually makes a nice segue into our first section of cards, our win cons for the deck. First up is Beastmaster Ascension. This 3 mana enchantment provides our creatures a +5/+5 buff as long as we have attacked with at least 7 creatures, a requirement this deck can quickly achieve. This means our cats become 7/7s with haste and our dogs 8/6s with vigilance. It won't take long to wipe out our opponents if this sticks on the board. Akroma's Will is a 4 mana instant that can give our creatures flying, vigilance, and double strike, or lifelink, indestructible, and protection from all colours until end of turn, both if we have our commander out. This essentially allows us to attack without fear of blockers and deals damage equal to twice the power we have on board. Akromas can quickly end 1 to 2 players with even a moderate board of cats and dogs, especially the dogs, which are dealing 6 damage apiece. The lifelink can also become surprisingly relevant if we are up against decks that aggressively attack life totals. Triumph of the Hordes really takes advantage of the creature tokens Jinnie gives us, providing them with +1/+1, trample and infect until end of turn on top of their already respectable power toughness stats. This can easily wipe multiple opponents out of the game and will really hurt the players who don't go wide or even run that many creatures in general. In addition, having the ability to set up a big triumph with dog tokens the turn prior or creating cats with haste means this card is always a major threat to your opponents, something most other token decks can't make claim to. Terror of the Peaks allows us to deal damage to any target based on the power of any creature that ETBs under our control. This offers us a non-combat damage way of beating our opponents and even interacting with their creatures and planeswalkers. Terror particularly takes advantage of our dog tokens, allowing every dog that enters to become a lightning bolt, which can quickly clear a board of troublesome creatures and reduce our opponent's life totals. Everything that was said about Terror can be said about the next card, Warstorm Surge, which is essentially the enchantment version of this effect. The reason for including this redundant piece is simple. It is such a powerful effect, we are happy to have another one, especially on an enchantment which is typically harder to remove. And that covers our major win cons. Now those are just our most direct and powerful ways of winning the game, but because we are a token deck that plans on going wide, sometimes we will just win by repeatedly going to combat. But with that out of the way, let's look at the cards that will draw us cards and really take advantage of our tokens. Our first card is Benny Brax, Zoologist, who is a 4 mana creature that has Convoke, meaning we can pay part or its entire cost to cast it if we tap down enough creatures. It also allows us to draw a card at the beginning of each end step, provided we created a token that turn. This is a very strong card draw engine in this deck, Firstly, because we can cast it often for only 1 white mana, and secondly because generating a token each turn isn't too hard for this deck to do, meaning we can draw up to 4 cards a turn cycle with this out, which is a great rate for what we end up paying for it. Camaraderie is a 6 mana sorcery that gains us X life and draws us X cards based on the number of creatures we control. While certainly not card advantage we can get going early, in the mid to late game this can draw us a huge amount of cards and gain a respectable amount of life, which will certainly get us close to closing out the game. The +1/+1 buff it gives our creatures until end of turn is also a nice bonus, and in some cases will be quite useful, especially against another Goad-wide deck that has many 1/1s. Elemental Bond is a 3 mana enchantment that draws us a card every time a creature with power 3 or greater ETBs. Normally kept in check because it is expected to be played in big creature decks, our dog tokens break this apart by now drawing a card every time we replace whatever token we normally make with dogs. When we discuss some of our token generators later, you will see just how many cards this can potentially draw us. Garruk's Pack Leader is the 5 mana creature version of Elemental Bond and is included because it provides a body itself and the effect is powerful enough that we are happy to pay 2 extra mana for it. Esper Sentinel is a cheap body we can get down early that can potentially draw us some cards by taxing our opponent's first non-creature spell they cast each turn. In this deck, because of the number of cards we run that care about creatures and the quantity of those creatures in particular, having bodies serve the roles we need is ideal and increases the power of the deck. Huatli, Radiant Champion, is a 4 mana Planeswalker that if we ultimate, gives us an emblem that says, whenever a creature ETBs under your control, you may draw a card. Her +1 says, put a loyalty counter on Huatli for each creature you control. Normally ultimates are very difficult to get to, but in our deck her +1 helps us to easily get there, often in one turn. And if we can get her emblem the turn after, the amount of cards we can draw with this will be incredible, especially considering that our opponents will have no way of interacting with this once we have it. Huatli's -1 ability, given a creature +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures we control, can also be a way to get big damage through if she survives her ultimate, or an opponent is simply open and on low life. Oran Frostfang is a 5 mana creature that gives all our attacking creatures Death Touch and draws us a card for each one that deals combat damage to an opponent. This can potentially be a lot of card draw depending on how many creatures we have, and the fact they have Death Touch will make our opponents very hesitant to block, leaving them with the dilemma of giving us cards and taking damage, or losing their creatures. Rite of Harmony is a 2 mana instant that can also be flashed back for 4, and draws us a card whenever a creature or enchantment ETBs under our control for that turn. Although this is only a temporary effect, we have quite a few token makers that can generate 2 to 3 tokens per turn, some much more, so this can be a cheap way of refilling our hand early and then again later when we really need it. Rumor Gatherer is a 3 mana creature that says, whenever another creature ETBs under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, draw a card instead. As mentioned previously, making multiple tokens a turn isn't hard in this deck, and approximately half our non-land permanents are creatures also. So often we will get to draw at least 1 card a turn cycle with this, but we will also get to filter the top of our library a lot, helping to fix our draws into what we need. Skullclamp is a 1 mana artifact that we can pay 1 to equip to a creature, and if it dies, we get to draw 2 cards. If you remember earlier, I mentioned why it was important and actually helpful that our dog tokens had 1 toughness. Well, this is the reason why. Many players who have used or seen a Skullclamp know in the decks that can abuse it, it does a lot of work. Well, that is certainly true in our case, where we can turn every token into a dog and every dog into 2 cards for each 1 mana spent. Keep this out and your hand will never be empty. Smuggler Share is a 3 mana enchantment that says, at the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn, then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. So this card performs multiple roles, all of which are important for this deck. It can draw us cards or make us mana, and our opponents will have to slow their game plans down if they don't want us to have these things. In addition, when we don't need the mana, we can convert the treasures into bodies in preparation for a big swing come our turn. This is the first of many cards that produce tokens while also providing us with other benefits. Sylvan Library is a 2 mana enchantment that allows us to filter our draws and draw up to 2 additional cards per draw step if we pay the life. This is cheap to get down and helps us set up our board state faster and earlier. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, is a 4 mana creature that can't be countered, is indestructible, and draws us a card each time a creature of ours deals combat damage to a player. Like Oran, the card draw potential of this card can be quite high with the right board setup, but its real power actually comes from how protected it is. Coming with Indestructible gives it a lot of protection on the board from most types of removal, and being uncounterable protects it on the stack, meaning this effect is likely to stick once you cast it. Our last source of card draw is Welcoming Vampire, a 3-mana creature that draws us a card once per turn if a creature with power 2 or less ETB'd under our control. Unlike some of our other cards that took advantage of creating dogs, here we want our cats to enter the fray, as their 2/2 baseline helps us meet Welcoming Vampire's requirements. You should easily draw 1 card per turn cycle, and with even a mild board setup, it will often be 2 to 3 cards instead. As you can see, the tokens that Jinnie Fay makes us have enabled us to use some powerful card draw options, but now let's move on to the cards that can generate us mana. Avacyn's Pilgrim, Birds of Paradise, Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves are 1-mana creature ramp that not only give us a turn 1 play, but also contributes to our cards that care about creatures. Gilded Goose is a 1-mana creature that creates a food token upon ETB and can tap and sack a food to make 1 mana of any colour. We can also pay 2 mana and tap it and create a food token. So early game, this is a temporary mana dork that allows us to play a 3-drop turn 2, but in the mid to late game it creates a token upon ETB and can generate a token once per turn cycle. Bloom Tender is a 2-mana creature that can tap and add 1 mana for each colour among permanents we control. So in our deck, this can tap for up to 3 mana and curves nicely by casting it on turn 2 and then our commander on turn 3. This is efficient for the cost and also provides that important body. Circle of Dreams Druid is a 3-mana creature that taps and adds green for each creature we control. As you can imagine, in a token deck planning to go very wide, this creature will tap for a huge amount of mana and set us very far ahead. The 3 green pips may look tough in a 3-colored deck, especially early, but our land base takes care of this because just over half our mana symbols require green anyway. Cryptolith Rite is a 2-mana enchantment that gives all our creatures the ability to tap and add 1 mana of any colour. On its own, this is already powerful in any creature token deck, but for us we gain additional power. Because Jinnie makes cat tokens with haste, this means anytime we produce tokens and turn them into cats, we can tap them immediately for mana to cast more things. With this card and our commander out, it isn't hard to chain off and have a very explosive turn. Curse of Opulence is a 1-mana enchantment that says, whenever enchanted player is attacked, create a gold token. Each opponent attacking that player does the same. So with us being an aggressive deck and creating tokens early, we should be able to trigger this each turn. But it also has the upside that if our opponents get greedy or are desperate for the mana, we can also generate additional treasures or creatures. This is a great effect for the cost. No token deck would be complete without Dockside Extortionist, perhaps one of the most powerful treasure generators in the deck. A big burst of mana when we need it, and when we don't, a big burst of Hasty Cats or Vigilant Dogs to help close out the game. Earthcraft is a 2-mana enchantment that lets us tap a creature, regardless of summoning sickness, to untap a basic land. Like Cryptolith, this is a very powerful effect and can help us get into some very explosive turns. Gala Greeters is a 2-mana creature that says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on Gala Greeters, create a tap treasure token, or you gain 2 life. So this card can generate us mana when we need it, but if we opt for the treasure token to become a cat or dog, it triggers Gala again and we can gain life or make it larger. For such a low cost, this should accumulate us a good amount of value as the game progresses, especially if we can generate multiple treasure tokens a turn cycle. Growing Rites of Itlimoc lets us look at the top 4 cards of our library, reveal a creature card and put it into our hand upon ETB, but that isn't the reason we have it here. We have it because its second ability says, if we control 4 or more creatures, we transform it into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun, a land that can tap for green or, most importantly, can also tap and add green for each creature we control. So this can provide us with a huge amount of mana similar to Circle of Dreams Druid, but it is much harder to interact with being on a land. Monologue Tax is a 3-mana enchantment that creates a treasure token for us each time an opponent casts their second spell each turn. So at worst, our opponents play 1 spell per turn, preventing our treasure gain at the cost of slowing their game plan. But at best, we generate multiple treasures each turn cycle, helping us prepare for a bigger turn when it comes around to ours. Professional Facebreaker is a 3-mana creature that creates a treasure token for each opponent we dealt combat damage to. In addition, it also gives us the ability to sacrifice those treasures to exile the top card of our library and play that card this turn. So Facebreaker is mana acceleration most of the time, and when we need it, card advantage too. Having both of these abilities on a card in a deck that plans to be aggressive is very powerful, and it should do some good work. Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, like Facebreaker, is mana and card advantage in one card. If we deal combat damage to an opponent, we make a treasure and exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, we can cast that card. So early, Ragavan helps accelerate our mana with the option to store that mana if we want to accelerate into a quick 4 to 6 mana value card. But mid to late game, While less powerful because blockers will usually be on board by then, we can still take advantage of the body with cards like Welcoming Vampire and Skull Clamp. Rose Room Treasurer is a 4-mana creature that says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, create a treasure token if this is the first or second time this ability has resolved this turn. Otherwise, you may pay X. When you do, Rose Room Treasurer deals X damage to any target. So firstly, this acts as a very strong treasure generator in this type of deck, with the potential to add up to 8 treasure tokens a turn cycle. But it also acts as interaction, being able to dump mana into it on the 3rd trigger and targeting anything. Sometimes that's just what you need to remove that problematic creature or planeswalker, and it can even be enough to end a player's life if you have a lot of mana available. Smothering Tithe is a powerful mana generator on its own, making a treasure every time an opponent draws a card unless they pay 2. But in this deck it pulls double duty, because if we have enough mana we can convert all those treasures into cats or dogs. Sometimes that happens with cards like these. You generate a lot of mana, but with few cards in hand or anywhere to dump that mana, you can't close out the game. With Jinnie Fay, we don't have that problem, and can pivot to whichever tokens serve our needs best at the current time. Song of Frey Elise is a 2-mana enchantment saga that on its 1st and 2nd lore counters allows your creatures to tap for 1 mana of any colour, but on the 3rd it sacrifices and gives all your creatures vigilance, trample and indestructible until end of turn, in addition to a permanent +1/+1 counter. While not as powerful overall as its cousins Cryptolith Rite and Earthcraft, the effect is so powerful in this deck it is still worth running. And don't underestimate that 3rd ability, because sometimes that will be enough to really hurt at least one opponent, especially if you set up for it the turns prior. Tireless Provisioner is a 3-mana creature that creates a treasure or food token whenever a land ETB is under our control. Now though we will get to talking about lands later, I will just say this deck runs every fetch land possible to take full advantage of landfall triggers, so it won't be uncommon to get 2 landfall triggers from this a turn cycle. While we will mostly be opting to make treasures using Provisioner, being able to create treasure, food, or creatures gives us some really good options depending on what's happening in the game, because yes, sometimes those food tokens and the 3 life they give you will become relevant, and when you do need them, you'll be glad to have them. Our last mana acceleration piece is the 4-mana Planeswalker, Zenegos the Reveller. If we use its first ability, it adds any combination of green and or red mana based on the number of creatures we control. So it essentially acts as a more expensive version of Circle of Dreams Druid or Itlamok, but it also gives the ability to add red to that mana, which can actually be quite important for some of our more expensive cards. As mentioned earlier, any of these generate mana based on number of creature effects are very powerful, and we want to include as many as we can. In a pinch, it can also generate a creature token on its own if our board is empty, perhaps after a wipe, and can really help to re-establish a board state. And that's it for our mana acceleration cards. Now let's have a look at how we're going to interact with our opponents and take advantage of all the bodies on the field. So first up is 2 cards we already mentioned under our win conditions, Terror of the Peaks and Warstorm Surge. With the right setup, sending that damage to the face makes the most sense and is what you should do. But sometimes you aren't ready to close out the game that way and need to remove problematic creatures or planeswalkers. With each dog generating a lightning bolt, it won't be long before the board is clear of creatures, so when you are ready to swing in, you can do so easily. Goblin Bombardment is a 2-mana enchantment that lets us sacrifice our creatures to deal 1 damage to any target. While we don't typically want to sacrifice our creatures because our power comes from having a wide board state, sometimes a creature or planeswalker comes down that can dramatically change the game if it isn't removed. This is also really great against board wipes, as it can at least do some damage on the way out. Pest Infestation costs 1 green and XX and says, destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments, create twice X 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So this card serves to be artifact and enchantment removal, as well as a token generator, which is more useful than it appears. A lot of the time with these X interactive pieces, you remove a lot of problematic permanents, but you also just spent your whole turn doing so without accelerating your board state. In our deck, this card slows our opponents down while also speeding our game plan up, which is quite powerful. Next up is arguably the best artifact and enchantment removal in the game, Aura Shards. For 3 mana, this enchantment allows you to destroy an artifact or enchantment whenever a creature you control ETBs. I don't think much else needs to be said, except that in a token deck like this, it will not be long before all your opponent's artifacts and enchantments are gone from the board if this stays on the table. Kwasali Slingers is a 5-mana version of Aura Shards in this deck, where for every cat that ETBs, including itself, you can also destroy an artifact or enchantment. Once again, we see the relevance of the tokens Jinnie creates, in this case our cats being able to trigger this powerful effect. Everything I said about Aura Shards is true here also. If this lasts on the table, your opponent's artifacts and enchantments won't. And that sums up our interactive package. Now I know it might not seem like much, but in our deck where we plan to go wide fast and aggressively, player removal is the best removal, so we only run the best pieces here. With that said, we've talked a lot about cards that care about tokens or have major payoffs when tokens come on the battlefield, so let's discuss cards now that create lots of tokens. First up is Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, a 3-mana creature who generates a 1/1 white human creature token for each opponent when she attacks. This is a great token producer for the cost, which is made even better that we can repeat it each turn. In addition, Adeline herself can become quite the combat threat, having vigilance and her power based on the number of creatures we control. If we cast this early, Adeline will become a progressively more dangerous threat that your opponents will have to deal with quickly. Bootlegger's Stash is a 6-mana artifact that gives all our lands the ability to tap and create a treasure token. So on its own without our commander out, this gives us a way to store mana for a big upcoming turn, but that isn't why this is here. This is here to give our lands the ability to tap and create a dog or cat token. While this is a big initial investment, if it sticks, we will very quickly be able to flood the board with creature tokens, in addition to taking full advantage of cards that care about tokens being made once per turn, like Benny Brax or Gala Greeters. Dragon Broodmother is a 6-mana creature that creates a 1/1 dragon with Flying and Devour 2 every upkeep. There are a number of cards we run that care about creatures ETBing once each turn, so this goes a long way towards helping them. In addition, if we just need to connect and the Flying gives us the evasion we need, we can just make the last dragon that enters before our turn devour a bunch of tokens to have a huge flyer ready to swing in and finish an opponent. Dragon Lair Spider is a 6-mana creature that creates us a 1/1 insect every time an opponent casts a spell. It won't take long for this to get very out of hand, especially against opponents who have low mana curves and plan on casting many spells across a turn cycle. In fact, it isn't inconceivable that just one turn cycle with this out could create enough creatures to take an opponent out, or at the very least severely threaten their life total. Indulge in Excess is a split card that offers 2 options. The Indulge side allows us to create a 1/1 citizen that is tapped and attacking for each creature we control that attacks this turn, and Excess allows us to make a treasure token for each creature that dealt combat damage this turn. This has the potential to be a very explosive card in this deck, even when we are only casting one half of it, but being able to do both, making tokens on attack and then again for the ones that dealt damage, means if we don't need the treasure, we can just convert them into more cats or dogs, leaving us with a board state that is likely going to be enough to close out the game next turn. Krenko, Tin Street Kingpin, is a 3-mana creature that says, whenever he attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on him, then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to his power. So Krenko serves a similar role to Adeline, making us tokens on attack, and though he won't typically become the combat threat Adeline does, he exchanges that by making us tokens that will definitely survive, and he makes more of those tokens the longer he survives. Ideally, we want to play this early, where he will have the most chance to become a major threat, but even mid to late game, we can just target the player who typically has a low creature board state. Old Gnawbone is our strongest treasure generator in the deck, allowing us to create treasures based on the amount of combat damage dealt to an opponent. Old Gnawbone can simply end games by even lasting a single turn with the amount of treasures it can generate, especially considering how wide our board can get with 2 and 3 power creatures. Even on its own with no other creatures, it can generate 7 treasures when it connects, which is impressive, let alone what we could do with the rest of our creatures. In this deck, Old Gnawbone will be a kill on sight creature for your opponents. Prosperous Partnership is a 3-mana enchantment that creates 2 1/1 citizens on ETB, and also has the ability that allows us to tap 3 untapped creatures we control to create a treasure token. For 3 mana, we immediately get 2 bodies, which is great because it already helps to fuel its ability. But this card really helps us take advantage of our dogs, because we can go to combat, swing with them, and since they are vigilance, they remain untapped so we can tap them for treasures before our next turn. Rabble Rousing is a 5-mana enchantment that has Hideaway 5, meaning when it ETBs, we get to look at the top 5 cards of our library and exile one of them under it. Then it has an ability that says, whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, create that many 1/1 green and white citizen creature tokens. Then if you control 10 or more creatures, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Now while the Hideaway ability is certainly useful and something we can achieve without too much difficulty, that triggered ability is why it's really here. Being able to essentially double the number of creatures we have and then having them come in untapped and not attacking means we can just attack without impunity. This card will put a serious clock on your opponents and is another must-answer threat in our deck. Scoot Swarm helps us to put our lands to good use, creating a 1/1 insect if we control 5 or fewer lands, but then making a copy of itself if we control 6 or more. Though we run no cards that provide extra landfall, we do run every fetch possible as mentioned earlier, which will help to sometimes get 2 triggers from this card. But honestly, once we get to 6 lands, Scoot Swarm just naturally gets out of hand on its own and can potentially generate a lot of tokens if it survives long enough. It also has inbuilt protection because once it starts copying itself, a board wipe is the only answer most decks will have to get rid of this effect. Tendershoot Dryad is a 5 mana creature that creates a 1/1 Saproling at the beginning of each upkeep. In addition, those Saprolings gain +2/+2 as long as we have the City's Blessing. Creating tokens during each upkeep synergizes well with our cards that care about once per turn effects, but the great thing is that even without our commander out, Tendershoot provides a reasonable threat on its own with the bodies it creates and the buff it gives them. Cards that work well with or without our commander are always welcome additions for the deck. Our last token maker is Tireless Tracker, a 3 mana creature that creates a clue every time a land ETB is under our control. So we have another creature that creates tokens based off landfall, and while not as powerful with regard to raw token generation like Scoot Swarm, it does give us the ability to draw cards with clues if we need it. Having access to card draw, even when it may be less efficient than other options, is always welcome compared to no card draw, and when you consider cards like Itlamok, Zenegos, or the numerous treasure makers we run, sometimes paying 2 to crack a clue won't be much of a cost at all. And that sums up the cards that are there to generate numerous tokens for us. Now let's move on to the cards that provide us additional utility and power to the cards we've just discussed. First up is Academy Manufactor, who says if you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead create one of each. In our deck, we have 15 cards that can create any of these token types, and while my personal preference would be to have at least 20 for consistency's sake, essentially tripling our token production is so powerful it's still worth including. Not only this, but it's important to note the extra tokens Manufactor is making are relevant for us. Having access to extra mana, card draw, and even life gain can sometimes be the difference between a win or a loss, especially if the game gets grindy. Anointed Procession and Parallel Lives perform the same role as 4 mana enchantments, doubling any tokens we create, including non-creature tokens. This is quite simply a very powerful effect in a token deck and will set us very far ahead if it sticks around. Eternal Witness provides us with some much needed recursion to get back the cards we need to interact or close out the game by allowing us to return any card to our hand upon its ETB. Heroic Intervention is a 2 mana instant that gives our permanents hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Whenever you play a deck that relies on creatures on the battlefield, the biggest problem can be protecting them from board wipes that can sometimes set you really far behind. Having protection such as this ensures you can protect your board state. Don't forget though, you can use this offensively as well. You can send the entire team in and cast this in response to blockers, so your opponents lose some of their creatures, but you don't. Grand Crescendo pulls double duty as protection and a token maker. For 2 mana and X, we create that many 1/1 citizens. Then creatures we control gain indestructible until end of turn. So our ideal use of this card is to cast it for a big X cost, create a threatening board, and then swing out for damage. But in some cases, we can just cast this for 2 mana to provide indestructibility in response to a board wipe. Having this kind of versatility is very welcome in a deck like this that takes full advantage of both modes it offers. Sometimes though, our opponents will get around our indestructibility with various exile, sacrifice, and negative X effects. Our answer to this is Guardian of Faith, a 3 mana creature with flash that phases out any number of creatures we control as it ETBs. This card is one of the most powerful effects we can run with regard to creature protection, as very few effects can get around this ability, especially as it pertains to mass creature removal. Basically, if this resolves, our creature board state is protected and all that is left is our other permanents in concert with our life total. But even then, sometimes you need to protect your entire board and your life total. For that, only one card can do the job, and that is Teferi's Protection. This 3 mana instant phases out all of our permanents, gives us protection from everything, and our life total can't change. Quite simply, Teferi's Protection is the best protection card we run, and it will do work every time you cast it. And that's it for our utility cards. Let's finish up by looking at our land package and any special lands worth mentioning. First up is Ancient Tomb, which is there to provide extra mana for casting some of our more expensive spells. While this mana can't be used to cast our commander, often we prefer to get other setup cards in place first before she comes down. Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, gives our lands the forest type in addition to their others, and helps fix our need for green, which makes up over half of our coloured casting cost requirements in the deck. Field of the Dead creates 2/2 zombies when a land ETBs if we control 7 or more lands with different names. This is a strong card on its own and makes our land drops pull additional weight, especially in the late game where land drops usually have less impact. Finally, as mentioned earlier, we run every fetch land we can to take advantage of all the token makers that care about landfall. The rest of our lands are there to fix our colours. And that's the deck. Jinnie Fay takes the go wide token strategy and breathes some fresh life into it by challenging you to play tokens in fun and interesting ways. Being able to pivot between token types means you feel like you get more out of your deck slots, because not many other token decks can make the claim that their token producers also provide them a source of mana, card advantage, and life gain. Perhaps the only downside of running this deck is the number of token types you'll have to carry around if you decide to play this in paper. But don't worry, I think with the amount of fun you'll have playing this, it'll be more than worth it. Well, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this look into Jinnie Fay and her loyal following of cats and dogs. If you'd like to see how the deck performs, make sure to stop by the channel where we will have some games up so you can see the deck in action. Until then, take care guys.